This is the Brave New Coin Crypto Conversation, hosted by Andy Pickering.
Hi everyone, Andy Pickering here. I'm your host and welcome to the Crypto Conversation, a Brave New Coin podcast where we talk to the people building the future in the Bitcoin, blockchain, and cryptocurrency space. Today's podcast is brought to you by Leverage, a new fully featured decentralized futures exchange without compromise. Are you ready to trade the future of crypto today? Well, Leverage is a DEX, so you can trade with your keys and sign orders just with one click, and Leverage is fast. Yes, indeed, Leverage is powered by Gluon, a new layer 2 solution with the scalability and speed of a centralized exchange and the super low fees of a DEX. Yes, Leverage, the new exchange that combines the best features of CeFi and DeFi, so you can trade crypto spot or crypto derivatives with up to 100x leverage while maintaining control of your assets at all times. It's like William Gibson said, the future is already here, but in this case, it's evenly distributed and completely decentralized. Go to leverage.io, and leverage is spelled Leverj.io, and trade the future of crypto today. My guest today is someone who needs no introduction. He is one of Bitcoin's best known evangelists, educators, and advocates. He, of course, is Andreas M. Antonopoulos. Welcome to the show, Andreas.
Oh, thank you so much, Andy. Thank you for having me on the show.
It's a pleasure. And look, as we record today, it's the 22nd of December 2020, and I think by the time people listen to this, it will be very early in January. And I think, Andreas, as much as it has been an incredibly memorable year for Bitcoin, I think most people are probably looking forward to turning the calendar year over. It is just an arbitrary number, but 2020 has been a little bit of a tough one, right?
It has. I have bad news. Nothing will change on January 1st. In fact, in many places, we're going to be heading into a very, very tough first quarter of the year. But nevertheless, I think things are beginning to, we're beginning to see hope on the horizon. And, at this point, after 9 or 10 months of this, I think people are beginning to see that there will be an end.
Yes, indeed. I think so too. Well, look, there's lots to talk about today, Andreas, and obviously there's always lots going on. Things are just moving at pace around the world, whether it's geopolitics or the crypto asset markets. So first off, obviously, because we seem to be in a bull market again, and when prices are tracking up, of course, there is renewed interest in crypto as an asset class, but that also attracts the scammers and the bad actors, and possibly also the hacks, and of course, Ledger, the hardware wallet people. So this week we learnt that their entire email list of, I think, around 1 million email subscribers was leaked, and possibly even worse was a list of their actual customers, about over 200,000 customers who had actually bought hardware wallets, and this list contained their names, email, phone numbers, and home addresses. And I know you've just published an episode of your podcast or on your YouTube channel about this hack, and so I'd love it, Andreas, if you could just briefly summarize your position on this and your advice for anyone affected by that.
Yes. Well, it was an unfortunate hack. It happened back in July. It affected people who had bought a device from their shop as well as signed up to their newsletter somewhere between 2018 and up to about June 2020. The really big risk here is some of the personal information that was released in this dump of about 272,000 customers for the shop included phone numbers and physical addresses in addition to email and name. What we've seen since September has been a flurry of phishing activity. Phishing is when you receive an email or a text message, most of them with text messages, that attempt to create a sense of fear, urgency, sometimes greed, in order to make you act rashly. Usually what they're trying to do is get you to visit a website where you're told that your device is being disabled, your amount is being stolen by someone, and if you don't take action immediately, something bad will happen. And the action that they try to make you take is to reveal your 12 to 24 word mnemonic phrase, which is the basis of your entire security, by typing it into a website. Now, the simple advice is do nothing. Inaction in this particular case is probably the best strategy. Almost all of these attacks attempt to create a false sense of urgency in order to make you act rashly and without thought, which then gets you into trouble. Funds on these devices are perfectly safe as long as you don't do something. And these messages are all fake. The company does not have information about your device, cannot freeze it or seize it or stop it from working. They cannot tell you if someone's withdrawing money. Of course, no one's withdrawing money. Your device can't be attacked remotely just because they know your email or phone number. So that's the phishing stage. A more serious type of attack is what's called SIM swapping. That's where by using your phone number, they know your phone number, so they contact your cellular phone company, and they attempt to socially engineer one of their customer service operators to transfer control of that number to a SIM card and mobile phone they control, which then allows them to receive text messages. And if you use this as a two-factor authentication with a text message code on any service, they can then hijack that account. They would probably start with your cryptocurrency exchange accounts. So if you have an account on an exchange and you use two-factor authentication, and they would then attempt other services, including bank accounts, for example, and things like that. And most disturbing of all, they would try to use this to do a phone-based recovery to compromise your primary email address, which, of course, then leads them to be able to do password resets on every other service you have. These types of attacks can be devastating. Even if you don't lose cryptocurrency, which you may well lose from an exchange, they can cause incredible damage to your privacy, incredible damage to your online life and experience in general. In our live stream, we provided a number of steps that people can take to protect themselves specifically against SIM hijacking, or SIM swapping as it's called, to harden their primary email address, to use stronger two-factor authentication, and to remove phone numbers as two-factor authentication, et cetera, et cetera. So more there if you want to watch that.
Yes, and I certainly recommend that that people do that, especially if you are a holder of crypto assets. And I guess part of the context here also, Andreas, is, there's still this tension behind the idea of, the Bitcoin idea of be your own bank and not your keys, not your coins. And then, also the reality that for a large number of potential Bitcoin holders, especially new people that might be, looking to buy Bitcoin now, and they're doing that purely as an investment or a hedge. They're not necessarily intending to go too far down the rabbit hole in terms of using Bitcoin for transactional purposes just at the moment. It's not to say they won't in the future, but from that perspective, it almost feels like for quite a large sector of those investors, it probably makes sense for them to use a third-party custodian, or even if they're lucky enough to be able to access one of the few reputable crypto exchanges, even leave some of their assets on the exchange until they can really take the time to really learn how to secure those assets, because the learning curve is still steep, isn't it?
I will agree partially with what you just said. I'll tell you, I'm the person who coined the expression "your keys, your coins," not your keys, not your coins, because
Yes.
what I wanted to describe is the idea that In cryptocurrency, custody and control are the same thing. So your ownership is defined only by control of your private keys. The simple truth of the matter is that while this leak of a database of names, addresses, and phone numbers is disturbing and problematic and can lead to various types of attacks, it pales in comparison to the billions and billions of dollars that have been stolen directly from exchanges. Exchanges and hosted wallets are not secure. They're not secure because they concentrate the funds of thousands of customers under a single ownership structure and control structure. If you have the funds of 1,000 customers, your security needs to be 1,000 times better than the security of each of the individual customers, because an attacker can simply attack the honeypot and not worry about robbing each individual bee, if you like the analogy. The problem in information security terms is that 1,000 times better security than you can achieve in your home doesn't exist. Even a newbie who doesn't really do very well with their own security is still, in many cases, just through sheer numbers, through asymmetry, going to be better off holding their own keys. There are exceptions to this rule, of course. There are some reputable exchanges that have not yet been hacked, that have not yet have the government seize their assets, that have not so far abused customers, seized the assets or frozen the assets of customers, et cetera, et cetera. But that is the trend. And the problem is that if you put your money on a cryptocurrency exchange, you don't remove risks. You simply substitute one set of risks, which have to do with personal control, responsibility, technical skill, and learning, with a completely different set of risks, which have to do with trusting in the exchange, all of its employees, potential hackers that might get into it, the government that might seize things, et cetera, et cetera. So I will not necessarily say that people are better off just leaving their money on an exchange. I don't think that's true. I think this is one of the rare areas where you can actually increase your financial success through learning, through education, and people can take control and take responsibility over their funds. Leaving things on exchanges is in itself risky. Now, there are some people who simply lack that technical skill and have no interest in ever learning. For those people, yes, they will choose to use exchanges. But I think it is very risky to look at this one isolated event and assume that that means that people can't do this and give up on hardware wallets or give up on self-custody and have people move their funds to exchanges, because the risks there are they're not immediately obvious, but they're much, much greater.
Yes. And look, I mean, I've got a quote in front of me from yourself when you say, the powerful idea at the core of Bitcoin self-sovereignty is indeed incredibly empowering, but it does have an unspoken element that requires persistent competence. And I think that is self-explanatory there. And look, again, Andreas, also, the idea that these, centralized databases are honeypots, of course, could not be more true. And unfortunately, some of the people that are, at least, some crypto exchanges, the good ones, are probably the best equipped to defend themselves against hackers because they understand the kind of honeypot that they're sitting on. But even, let's talk about, what's going on in the US at the moment. So I guess to begin with, if we're talking about centralized databases that are getting accessed by bad actors, obviously there's, leaving the political side of it to the side, there's some kind of ongoing nation state hack that has taken place this year against the US, and the Treasury Department, I understand, has been one of the most affected. And yet at the same time, the Treasury Department have just proposed some fairly interesting new regulations that target the crypto asset industry, haven't they?
Yes, the proposed regulation, which is, once again, an attempt to extend a totalitarian financial surveillance structure over the entire world, with complete disregard for the consequences and side effects on billions of innocent people, is shocking. I mean, the bottom line is that all of this is wrapped in the self-righteous and very easy to sell idea that it prevents crime, and of course they bundle in all of the worst kinds of crimes, terrorism, child pornography, whatever. But the truth, and if we look at the facts, is that for decades now, every study that's ever looked at the effectiveness of anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, know your customer regulation proves that they prevent a vanishingly small amount of those activities. And they very often fail because the organizations most responsible for large-scale money laundering for some of the worst people like narcos and terrorists are the banks themselves, which not only do it, but they also get away with it with minuscule punishments that are simply a cost of business. This structure, however, has horrific side effects. The side effects include condemning billions of people into poverty because of economic exclusion, because of creating so many barriers to participation in the world economy, creating structures of corruption, surveillance, privacy violations, enabling dictators to control their populations through measures that are disguised as economic measures, giving the ability to governments to create sanctions on entire countries filled with innocent people who have nothing to do with the things they're being sanctioned for, et cetera, et cetera. These don't actually stop criminals, but they do criminalize innocent behavior all around the world and penalize billions of innocent people, depriving them of financial access, of independence, of liberty, of privacy, of all of these things. So these are incredibly cynical measures, and they're cynical measures proposed by the most privileged who have never been affected by these measures, who have never been denied access to a bank account, who have never been delayed access to a payment, who have never had their money seized, frozen, or challenged by a bank. And they're now trying to extend them onto any form of payment, including cash and digital currencies, when those forms of payments have become the last safe haven, resort, and hope for billions of people who are excluded from the traditional financial system. Now, in all of that morality that they've wrapped around this to tell us that it's really for protecting us against criminals and terrorists, what they're doing, in fact, is enabling the worst criminals with banking licenses. And this is, at its core, and should be called out as such, a horrifically immoral and cynical measure. Now, from a practical perspective, let's look at what they're doing. They're asking small startups that don't have the infrastructure, security personnel, compliance personnel, et cetera, to collect information on their customers that exposes those customers to enormous risks in order to feed this surveillance machine. And by doing so, what they do is they reduce competition from banks because they increase the cost of working in this space. They stop innovation in digital currencies in any way that competes by banks by leveling the playing field down to the least common denominator of the banking system. And they're going to damage millions of innocent customers by creating these honeypots of information that will be leaked. They'll be leaked at the startup level, they'll be leaked by the banks that get hacked, and ultimately they'll also be leaked by the Treasury Department and government databases that they're collecting, because those have been hacked too.
Yes, and of course, at the moment they've sort of put an arbitrary limit. I think it's if the transaction is greater than 10,001
$3,000.
day or 3,001 single
$3,000.
transaction.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the idea being that, you know, if they were able to pass this legislation, then that could be dropped down very easily or inflated away, depending on whichever.
Or both.
The other thing that is quite cynical about this, Andreas, of course, is the timing. Now, you know, the Trump administration is 1 foot out the door. We're going into the Christmas holiday period, and this proposal has really just come a little bit out of the blue. There was some advance warning from some industry insiders who were aware that it was coming, but there's only really been given, as I understand it, you know, sort of a 15-day window for people to respond, which is always a little bit more challenging over the holiday period. Do you think this was this kind of cynicism was on purpose?
Oh, of course it was. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this isn't just cynicism. This is utter contempt. This is a tiny, superbly privileged and out of touch group of elite criminal banksters at the top. And if you study what Mnuchin has done in the past, he was at the head of the mortgage fraud industry and the robo foreclosure industry and got away with putting millions of people out of their homes. He is an absolute scumbag. Who, of course, got elevated into a position of enormous power in Treasury, and you know, with utter contempt towards the plebs of this country and every country in the world, in the last gasp of this administration, is throwing out this regulation and giving no opportunity for the democratic process, because they sneer at democratic process. Democratic process is a silly encumbrance on their power, and they have utter contempt for the population, for the voters, for anyone who would stand in their way. But that's par for the course. I mean, these people have been stuffing their pockets with rampant criminality and fraud for decades and getting away with it, and then have the audacity to turn around and pretend to be self-righteous protectors of law and order. We should respond with an equal amount of contempt. We should call them for what they are, which is amoral and immoral people who have been committing horrific crimes, but getting away with it because the system is stacked in their favor. And we shouldn't even kind of entertain their empty moralism. These are monsters, and they have utter contempt for us, and so we should return that favor.
Yes, indeed. Fantastically said, Andreas. And of course, you know, we need to understand that this is a US regulatory organization, the Treasury Department, that is proposing this legislation. However, of course, you know, it's one thing to try and impose a new KYC, AML, and increasingly restrictive KYC on, you know, the fiat on ramps and off ramps, but how do you see this potentially impacting, let's say, DeFi or the DEXs? Like, you know, in 2020, we've seen, you know, the rise of DEXs like Uniswap, and then outside of that, new DEXs like Leverage. How do you see the proposed regulation affecting DeFi?
Well, let me start with the first part of your statement there. You said this is a U.S. regulation and of
Sure.
course directed at the U.S. But the problem, however, is that the U.S. for 4 decades at least has been using international organizations like the IMF, the SWIFT Interbank Wire Transfer Network, the newly constructed FATF, which I keep forgetting what exactly the acronym means, so I just remembered it as fraudsters always talk about fraud. I'm pretty sure that's not what it means. The Financial Action Task Force is bullshit organizations. FATF and others are used to create global consensus on creating a global totalitarian surveillance network. And so while these are US regulations, these US regulations are designed to be emulated and are almost immediately adopted by other countries around the world to create a global framework, because you can't leave any cracks. Countries that do not comply immediately with this kind of imperial attitude of the United States then get to face sanctions, banking sanctions, exclusion from the wire transfer network, and various other limitations that basically are mobster rule. The US uses mobster tactics to bully other countries around the world if they dare to try to depart from this system of control. So this isn't just a US regulation. This is the basis for a global framework that is broadly and rapidly adopted around the world. Ironically, the only countries that are resisting somewhat are other big imperialist dictatorships like China and Russia. So we should all be worried, because when you see these regulations come up in the US, they're simply a matter of months away before you see mirror legislation being rammed through your own pseudo-democratic legislature. And so you will see these come home very soon. And although in some cases, as is the case with Australia very often, what they do is they do a trial process where they try it on a smaller, compliant democracy that has been implementing more and more extreme totalitarian measures. They try it there first. So they try various restrictions on civil liberties in Australia very often as a lab environment. And if they manage to ram them through and get limited resistance from the population, and they manage to pass undemocratic measures of surveillance and search and seizure and restrictions of political organization, assembly, association, digital restrictions, firewall restrictions, censorship, encryption laws, etc., then these get floated on the global stage by the US. You either see them eventually where you are, or you see them first because you're the lab rats. I don't want people to get complacent and think this is just the US.
Okay, that does make sense. And I suppose also what's happening, Andreas, is as Bitcoin becomes much more attractive as an investment from, let's say, Wall Street or the traditional legacy financial system. I don't know if you know who Ben Hunt, Epsilon Theory, is, but he just started his own podcast, which I listened to yesterday, and he was talking about how he sees the renewed or growing interest from Wall Street in crypto assets. And of course, his view is that there's no interest in terms of the actual price action. All Wall Street is interested in is capturing the flow around a new asset class. So if they see the birth of a new asset class and the ability to capture the flow or clip the ticket there, then that is how Wall Street will try and co-opt Bitcoin and tame it, if you like. But you've always talked about, Bitcoin being this idea of the poison pill, that if Wall Street tries to swallow it, Bitcoin, software is eating the world and Bitcoin will eat the financial system.
Yes, and we see that with both Bitcoin and other systems, including Ethereum and the DeFi applications that come after that. A great example is this new regulation. And to answer the second part of your previous question in the same time, this new regulation they pass requires financial institutions that are regulated to identify the destination of funds. The problem with that is that they've written it for a world in which you're doing wire transfers between people who have bank accounts. And of course, none of that applies in the blockchain. So one perfect example of that is is the fact that when you're doing a transaction whose destination is an Ethereum contract, a DeFi application, for example, there is no owner to identify. Therefore, you cannot comply with that regulation. Therefore, custodial accounts, hosted wallets, exchange wallets, etc., cannot use directly DeFi contracts because that would violate this regulation. So they've basically tied one hand behind their back because to continue to operate in a compliance model as a regulated industry requires them to forego the innovative uses of this that simply do not mesh with the regulation. And we're going to see this happen again and again and again. What it does is it makes the hosted wallets, the custodial wallets, the regulated institutions less functional, less flexible, less attractive, less innovative than the wide open, software-based, self-custody, self-controlled sovereign applications of the wide open borderless cryptocurrency domain and blockchain domain. And that applies to Bitcoin as we see various privacy features being adopted, and those throw a big old poison pill in the ability of exchanges to keep using it. Lightning Network, which reduces visibility into the destinations of transactions, and again throws a big old wrench in the ability of regulated institutions to use it. DeFi, which just completely messes it all up. Decentralized exchanges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They can regulate the things that look most like banking on the organizations that are organized and centralized most like banks. And so that's the part they attack. They have a hammer, and anything that looks like a nail, they whack it. But the problem for them is that all that does is it makes the organizations, institutions, and systems that are on the periphery of blockchains that look most like banks subject to their regulation. And when they regulate those, they make them less attractive to the rest of the ecosystem, while the rest of the ecosystem continues to innovate. If they continue doing this, they add another dimension, which is that the decentralized systems of innovation around this technology will increasingly see these regulations as a form of predation, as a threat, an attack against the ecosystem, and they will innovate against them. They will innovate defenses. They will innovate stealthiness. Just like dumping a new predator in a brand new ecosystem triggers a wave of evolution as every species in that ecosystem starts developing defenses. Maybe some of the species become poisonous or venomous or scaly or clawed or something like that. Same thing is happening here. These regulations are going to encourage the development and direction of innovation in decentralized systems towards more stealthy, more defensive, more private, more resistant technologies in order to counteract the regulatory impetus. And of course, what that does is it then makes these technologies even more of a poison pill. The regulated industries are caught in this environment where they're given no option. They can either become more and more and more like banks, which makes them lose all of their differentiation, all of their ability to innovate, and forces them to compete against banks that already have more financing, more regulatory capture, more cozy deals, more bought politicians. And it takes away the biggest tools they have to compete against those banks, which is the innovative aspects of these decentralized technologies. Meanwhile, they're also competing against the decentralized versions of themselves that are not subject to these regulations. And this is the PayPalization effect. You know, PayPal used to be a very innovative open system until it got turned into a bank. And increasingly, it finds it difficult to compete against banks that can do regulation, compliance, and surveillance much better. We're going to see this happen again and again in waves in our industry. Ultimately, it won't tame blockchains. It will only tame the banks that are playing in the blockchain space, and it will encourage innovation of defenses in the blockchain area.
Yes, such a great point, Andreas. And as much as governments will attempt to apply regulatory pressure wherever they can, which is really going to be the fiat on-ramps or any centralized company, wallet providers, people like that. But, if in terms of the blockchain protocol, if it's a decentralized protocol, there's nothing to regulate. It's just math. It's just 0 and 1s, and that is why blockchains need to be decentralized. But of course, we have really seen, Bitcoin has been a decentralized blockchain out in the wild for several years, or 10, 11 years, but really at scale for 5 years or so. But now, as you say, we have seen the birth of DeFi, and Ethereum is progressing almost at scale itself as Ethereum 2.0 comes into view. And I guess you've done this a little bit, but let's just cast our mind forward. We're coming to the end of 2020. What happens in 2030? What are the key currency battlegrounds of the next year or next decade, Andreas? So just sort of any thoughts on the big picture and what happens next?
It's impossible to predict. The thing about this is that we have this, we open the door to this domain of creativity and innovation in financial protocols that never existed before. And now we have all of these building blocks, and two things are happening in parallel. The first one, which has to do with composability and programmability, is that when you have a programmable system, like Bitcoin scripting language or Ethereum smart contracts, and you have composability as you have in Ethereum, but also in the upper layers of Bitcoin, where you can take something somebody else made, a tool, a library, a component, and you can combine it with other things other people made and make something new that didn't exist before by composing a new recipe based on the same ingredients, but combined in new, interesting ways. That creates an environment in which innovation accelerates over time. So there's innovation happening at 3 layers right now. The most obvious layer that we see is the end result, the applications. But these applications are like meals being cooked up in a kitchen, right? They depend on a recipe, but they come from a set of ingredients, right? So before you see the dish, you see the dish and you think, wow, this is amazing, this is new. But what you don't see is that behind the scenes, people are also innovating by making new recipes. And these recipes are new, interesting ways of combining the different ingredients. The third layer, which is even less obvious, is the fundamental ingredients themselves. What we've seen over the past couple of years, for example, is an explosion of primary research into new cryptographic protocols, things like zero-knowledge proofs with Starks and Snarks and things like that, in using those proofs to do interesting optimizations like roll-ups, optimistic roll-ups, things like that, using the basic building blocks to do new types of digital signatures, new types of elliptic curves, finding new homomorphisms within these elliptic curves and exploiting new characteristics. What most people don't realize is that when Bitcoin burst onto the scene, it created the first practical application at scale that provided funding for primary research in cryptography at a level that had never been seen before, which at the same time created an explosion of primary research. So not only are we seeing new applications, not only are we seeing new recipes and ways to combine these basic primitives, but we're also seeing a massive acceleration in fundamental research that is providing new ingredients to combine in new, interesting ways. People don't realize, because a lot of this stuff takes anywhere from 3 to 10 years to go from a research paper about a new cryptography trick to something you see that transforms an application on the internet. And I think that's what's happening in the blockchain, cryptocurrency, DeFi space. But then there's another thing that's happening, and that is that none of these technologies exist in a vacuum. They exist in a world in which some really unprecedented historical events are taking place that most people are oblivious to. And those historical events are taking place in two areas. One is geopolitics. We're seeing the complete collapse of the traditional world order and the emergence of a very, very complex multipolar world where there is intense competition on all fields of endeavor between countries like China, Russia, United States, European Union, et cetera. In these battles, information technology is now a very important component. And then in the financial realm, we're seeing a complete collapse of the basis of fiat economies. The brief period of experimentation of currencies that are not based on the gold standard, that can be printed to infinity, where central banks create stimulus when there's a recession and then supposedly tighten things when there isn't, has now reached a complete orgy of money printing that has never happened before. But we do know historically that this ends badly. So the world economy in itself is now a fragile house of cards with enormous amounts of intervention by central banks that frankly have no idea what they're doing because no one's ever done this before, in an environment of increasing income inequality and a very complex geopolitical environment. One of the reasons we can't predict what's going to happen out to 2030 or even 2023 is because all of the developments in the technology of cryptocurrencies, blockchains, financial instruments on the blockchain, governance, voting, trust, security, privacy, decentralization, censorship resistance, et cetera, that entire space is not only trying to change the world as it is, but it's also reacting to what the world is becoming. And the world is becoming increasingly unstable, and we're in domains that we've never been before. So, we may see enormous opportunities or challenges arise out of governments destroying their currency or destroying their political institutions, or making them increasingly fragile and unresponsive. And in those gaps, in those vacuums that are created by failures in traditional systems, we may see opportunities and developments and innovations that come out of decentralized systems. It really is a chaotic environment. There's no way to make any prediction. I mean, and if you do make a prediction, you end up being a fool. COVID is a perfect example of us getting something that no one expected and it completely upending the world order. This wasn't a financial event, but it's creating a parallel financial event with the massive amounts of stimulus and debt that have been created. And that hasn't yet hit. The impact of that and the implications of that haven't yet hit, and it's going to have enormous implications for cryptocurrencies.
Yes, a chaotic macro environment. Indeed, that is exactly right. Okay, let's go to a very quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll finish off on a more positive note. We'll talk about decentralized protocols as a source of hope. Back in one moment.
Are you ready to trade the future of crypto today? Introducing Leverage, a full-featured decentralized futures exchange without compromise. Leverage is a DEX. Trade with your keys and sign with one click. Leverage is fast. It's powered by Gluon, a layer 2 solution with the scalability and speed of a centralized exchange and the low fees of a DEX. Say goodbye to exchange hacks, front-running, Ethereum network congestion, and high gas fees. Leverage, the new exchange that combines the best features of CeFi and DeFi so you can trade crypto spot and derivatives with up to 100x leverage while maintaining control of your assets at all times. Like William Gibson said, The future is already here, but in this case, it's evenly distributed and completely decentralized. Go to www.leverj.io and trade the future of crypto today. For crypto indices and benchmarking, Brave New Coin's powerful indexing engine can calculate high-frequency intraday and end-of-day indices for a wide range of index products. Brave New Coin's custom indices team delivers experienced consultancy, premium data, and trusted calculation. Contact BNC today to find out more.
Let's finish this off, Andreas, and I'll finish it off by bringing it back to something you said at the beginning, which I really liked. And to put this in context, as you know, one of the big stories of this year, in terms of Bitcoin at least, has been, MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor, buying Bitcoin positions at serious size, and Michael Saylor, of course, emerging as an extremely vocal a Bitcoin bull, and using this incredible, powerful dragon language where he would talk about Bitcoin and the swarm of cyber hornets serving the goddess of wisdom, feeding on the fire of truth, exponentially growing, smarter, faster, stronger, behind a wall of encrypted energy. It's kind of out there wizard stuff, but it's gets people's attention, and I enjoy it. But what he's also done is he talks about Bitcoin as a source of hope. And so much so that he bought the domain name. If you go to hope.com, of course, that just redirects back to a whole lot of MicroStrategy Bitcoin related content. But you mentioned hope right at the beginning, Andreas, and I think that is key, because I think Bitcoin really does provide hope.
I'm a techno-optimist in that I believe that technology and progress with technology have historically freed people from the constraints of the past, have empowered individuals, have raised living standards, have improved the lives of billions, have made our world a more fair, just, and equitable place. Despite everything you see out there, the world has never been more peaceful, more fair, more just, more healthy than it is today, ironically. So the thing about technology, of course, is that technology is a human endeavor that comes into direct conflict with the past, and it requires us to look forward to the future, to be optimistic, to try to find the best in humanity, to elevate the good uses over the bad. Technology in itself is a neutral tool that we can use for good or evil. And of course, the reason I'm optimistic is because ultimately, when a new technology arrives on the scene, the first reaction by most people is to try to resist or deny or avoid. But that doesn't change anything. And a lot of people are scared about how this technology might be used for bad things. But the only way to really resolve all of these concerns is to put your emphasis, your energy, your creativity into amplifying the good things that technology can do. If you take the base assumption that the vast majority of human beings are good, they're well-natured, they're caring, they want to protect their families, their future, they want to build and create beautiful things, they're filled with love and empathy and caring for others. I strongly believe that is humanity. There are exceptions, of course, but the exceptions validate this rule. Humans are good. Humans are positive forces. If you trust, then technologies that are truly decentralized, that go directly in the hands of empowering individuals, will be used by those individuals to do good. And the reason that billions of us using simple tools to do good in the world is a powerful force, is because of our nature and because of the decentralized nature of these tools. There a lot of people are cynics and pessimists because they believe that humanity is fundamentally evil, or that there's something broken about human behavior. I don't believe that. And so when I look at a technology that can be used at scale by lots of people, And based on my understanding of human nature, I see immense hope. I see immense hope that if you allow people to act on their own impulses and give them power in the form of technology, the outcomes are massive good on a massive scale.
Fantastically said. All right, I think that is a very nice place to finish. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Andreas, and look, all the best for, well, the decade ahead, really. I'm sure we'll do this again next year, but all the best for now.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Andy. It's been a pleasure talking with you and being on the show. All the best for you and all of your listeners.
All right, that's us. We are out of here. Don't forget, if you did enjoy the show, please do feel free to give us a 5-star rating and even a nice review in Apple iTunes or the Apple Podcasts app. Would certainly appreciate that. Bye for now. See you real soon. This was the Crypto Conversation for Brave and You Kind.